The morning arrived without effort or intention. It did not announce itself, and it did not hurry. The light simply appeared, slowly resting on the edges of the old century, as it had done countless times before. There was no sudden brightness. The sun did not demand attention. It rose gradually, allowing the world to remain mostly unchanged. Shadows softened rather than disappeared, and the air held the same quiet temperature it had held for generations. This was a morning that belonged to no one in particular. It was not remembered later, and it was not anticipated beforehand. It existed only because mornings always did. Stone buildings stood where they had always stood. Their walls carried no messages and told no stories worth repeating. They were built to remain, and they succeeded at that purpose. The morning light touched them briefly and then moved on. A narrow street stretched between these structures. It was empty and comfortable in its emptiness. The ground showed signs of use, but not of urgency. Feet had passed here before, and would pass again, in much the same way. Windows remained closed, not because anyone slept too long, but because there was no reason to open them yet. The inside air and the outside air were not very different. Neither required change. Somewhere a door opened slowly, not because it was time, but because it was routine. The sound was soft and familiar. It did not echo, and it did not linger. A person stepped outside without pause. They did not look around as if expecting something new. The street looked as it always had, and that was enough. They adjusted their pace to the morning, which was already slow. There were tasks to be done, but none that could not wait, none that required speed. The morning allowed for repetition, and repetition allowed for calm. A simple table inside a stone room held a few objects. They were arranged not for beauty, but for convenience. They had been placed there long ago, and no one saw a reason to move them now. The air carried a faint, ordinary scent of old wood and stone. It was not strong enough to notice unless one tried, and no one tried. Outside, the sky remained pale and open. Clouds rested in loose formations, not moving quickly enough to suggest change. They drifted, because drifting was what clouds did. The street slowly accepted more movement, though it never became busy. One figure crossed from one doorway to another. Another followed later. There was no greeting that needed remembering. Footsteps echoed lightly against stone and then faded. The sound did not disturb the morning. It fit into it naturally, as if it had always been part of the background. Nothing important happened. This was not a failure of the morning. It was its defining feature. In this old century, ordinary moments were not interruptions. They were the structure of life. Time passed without being measured. No bells rang to mark the hour, and no one looked toward the sky for signs. The morning simply continued. Light moved slightly higher, resting on different surfaces, changing nothing of importance. The buildings accepted it without reaction. The street remained steady. The people moved slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of habit. Their pace matched the century itself, which had never learned to rush. This morning did not lead to an event. It did not prepare for anything unusual. It existed fully on its own, and that was enough. And so the old century continued its day, beginning with a morning so ordinary that it required no memory at all. The morning continued without changing its tone. The light grew a little stronger, but not enough to suggest urgency. It spread evenly across stone and earth, resting wherever there was space. The street remained quiet. its surface worn smooth by years of slow movement. There were marks in the stone, but none of them told a story worth telling. They were simply signs that time had passed. A window opened slightly, just enough to allow air to move. The motion was careful and unremarkable. No one leaned out to look, and no one inside felt the need to speak. Inside the buildings, rooms stayed much the same. Objects remained where they had been left the night before. They waited without purpose, confident that they would be used again when needed. A small fire had burned earlier, and now only warmth remained. There was no smoke, and no attention given to its absence. The heat lingered quietly, as if unsure whether it was still required. People moved from one familiar place to another. They did not check the sky, and they did not measure the time. They knew the order of the morning well enough to follow it without thought. Hands performed simple actions that had been repeated many times before, lifting, placing, adjusting. Each movement led to the next, and none of them required decision. Outside, a bird rested on a ledge. It did not call out, and it did not fly away. It stayed where it was until it chose to move later. There was no reason to hurry. The air remained calm. It carried no strong sounds and no strong scents. It simply existed between buildings and fields, holding the morning together. Further down the street, another doorway opened. The sound blended into the background, neither louder than before nor softer. The street accepted it easily. Two figures passed one another without stopping. They acknowledged each other with small movements that did not interrupt their pace. No words were needed. The ground felt solid and familiar beneath each step. There was comfort in knowing exactly how it would feel. The street had not changed and did not intend to. Time continued without interruption. The morning did not shift suddenly toward afternoon. It allowed itself to stretch, unconcerned with progress. Shadows shortened slightly as the light rose. This change was subtle enough that it went unnoticed. The buildings did not react, and neither did the people. In the distance, fields lay quiet. They waited as they had always had, unimpressed by the movement of the day. The earth held its shape and remained still. No events gathered, no news traveled, no plans were altered. The morning remained ordinary in every sense. A person paused briefly, not because something had happened, but because there was nothing else to do yet. The pause passed naturally, and movement resumed. The sounds of the morning remained soft and predictable. Footsteps, wood, stone. These were not sounds that demanded attention. They were part of the environment. Nothing was finished, and nothing began. The morning existed in the middle of itself, comfortable and unremarkable. And so it continued quietly, as mornings in the old century always had, without asking to be noticed and without becoming anything more than what it was. The morning moved forward without changing its pace. It did not become brighter in a noticeable way, and it did not lose its calm. The light simply adjusted itself slightly, as if finding a more comfortable position. The street held its familiar stillness. Even with a few more footsteps passing through, it never felt crowded. Each sound settled quickly and then disappeared, leaving the quiet intact. A cart stood near the edge of the road. It had been there since before the morning began, and no one paid it much attention. The wheels rested firmly against the ground, unmoving and patient. Nearby, a door remained open just enough to allow light inside. The opening did not invite conversation. It existed only to let the room breathe. Inside, shadows rested in the corners of the space. They were soft and stable, not shifting quickly.
The walls accepted them without change. A person sat briefly, then stood again. The movement was slow and familiar, as if it had been practiced many times before. No thought followed the action. Outside, the sky remained wide and quiet. Clouds drifted without forming anything recognizable. They moved because movement was natural, not because they were going anywhere. The air carried the same gentle coolness as before. It did not demand warmer clothing or invite restlessness. It simply stayed. A bird crossed the sky at an unhurried pace, then disappeared beyond the buildings. No one followed it with their eyes. The moment passed without becoming important. Further along the street, another figure walked slowly toward the fields. There was no